Okay, so you are looking at the components, mostly very vintage, except for this. This is a different type of item that didn't come with this machine. I have added it as it lacked a buckle. But in any case, as you can see, one thing that doesn't have the same color as the rest is that one there, and there's a reason. But what we're looking at here is a very vintage rotating cylinder circular sock knitting machine that was not made with a ribber. So this machine has a very old manual, and they referred to it as Gearhart's high-speed knitting machine. My understanding is this machine is an 1893, but I could be wrong by a year or two. All right, and this machine is a very lightweight machine. It came with a 56 cylinder and a 72 cylinder. It came from an American eBay listing that was then shipped to my friend, and my friend shipped it to me here in Canada. But this is the components of the machine without the buckle that it came. Packaged twice, as the package arrived at my friend's and they packaged it further. It arrived here in Canada. It was intact. It had in the machine itself, it had the original 72 cylinder in it, and it was warped. And it had the 56 cylinder extra with it. And it was tight to turn, and it needed some TLC with an arrangement with Dave Lord at Shampoo at CSM. We packaged it up like nobody's business and sent it off to them. After talking with them about it, they painted it a lovely black and some of the other components. The original 72 was too warped. It could not be rescued. So they created a brand new one for the machine itself. And so this is a brand new modern version of the 72 that is designed to go with this very vintage machine. And please excuse all the oil. I have just taken it apart for this video, and of course there's oil on it, which is not a bad thing for this machine. This is everything you need for this circular sock knitting machine. This machine did not come fabricated with a ribber. So the manual of a later version of this brand machine calls this part here, it calls it the frame, but newer machine manuals from other brands call this a bed plate. So I'm just going to flip it around. Now you could possibly slightly see a repair. All right, so that's what it looks like. Now this is a very unique machine in that instead of the outside shell turning, as with more modern machines, the inside cylinder turns. This machine has only one thumb screw to connect it to a table. And because of the repair done, the placement of some of the parts are a little bit different here. But we'll go over that as we get to it. So this, by the book, is called a frame, but I call this a bed plate. Okay, this is the foundation of the machine. So with this part, what happens is the crank wheel goes through here. And this is what we often call the crank wheel. It doesn't say what they call this here, but in any case, this goes through this part here. And as it is the style it is, it's going to connect to a geared ring here called a cog ring, but they call it something different. They call the cog ring a crown wheel. So, you know, same parts, thereabouts, different names back then, different brand names, use different names for the same things. The crank wheel is going to connect to a part on the bottom of the machine that's connected to the cylinder, and we generically call that a cog ring. Okay, So with no other parts in place, it just turns, or backwards. Okay, there we go. So take that out. All right. So this is what I call a cog ring. The older manual for this machine called this a crown wheel. It could be a crown on top of your head, but basically the gears that you see here are placed on the bottom of a cylinder and secured with 4 screws all the way around. And then when it's in the bed plate and the crank wheel is turned by the handle, it connects here and it goes around and around. So this is a unique design because this special part stays connected to the cylinder, whereas more modern machines, the cog wheel stays on the machine and the cylinders get changed in and out. All right, this will make more sense as we go, but just as an example, you can see this 56 cylinder has got some marks where the screws were attached to it. A vintage cylinder for this machine was made out of lead. This one here is made out of lead. I thought it would be lighter, but actually it's heavier. So you fit this cog ring on it, add the 4 screws. Those 4 screws are way over there. And then you would put it in the machine a certain way. And when you're working with it, the cylinder turns. It's pretty cool. So it's a little more work to switch cylinders if you are wanting to switch them on this machine versus a different style machine, but it is still very possible. So it's very cool. All right, see what else. So this is a kind of 2-in-1. You're seeing the inside of the machine here with the uplift cams, the left one, the right one, and when it sits in the machine, they help direct the needles into place. I call this a yarn guide. They call this a thread carrier. And they also call this part here, they just call this a cam. Well, technically, yes, the inside part here is a cam, but this is a 2-in-1 part. As you can see, this is like a regular yarn carrier in that the yarn goes through here and then through the machine. But it's connected on the outside of the machine here with this post over here, the cam shell bed plate. But we'll show you how it goes together as we go. Do be careful with your cams here. They look like little birds because they do come off their posts, or rather their inserts. Left cannot fit in right, right cannot fit in left. They're very unique, but that's what that inside part looks like. It's pretty cool. And on this side, it says J.E. Gearhart, Clearfield, PA. So what we have here are stem weights, like the newer machines. This one actually came with 1 stem weight and 1 extra puck, and that's as much weight as you need. You see this here? This is a vintage corkscrew cast-on device. So once you are all cast on, you would hang your stem weight there on the inside of the machine. There are people that make a version of this nowadays. I believe someone else online is now making a version of them. My preference is not this style of cast-on device, but as it came with the machine, I'm certainly going to include it where it ends up in the future. All right, so, and this is quite obviously the handle for the crank wheel. It fits in the crank wheel a specific way. This is the crank wheel. So it fits in here, and then that screw gets tightened, rather like this. I'll show you how that works. In case you were curious about some of the other parts, this is a Vintage Gearhart hold down tool. So you'll notice that this machine doesn't have more than one set of stem weights, because when you were going back and forth to make the heel or toe, you would put this inside the machine and you would pull down. Some people believe that when you're making a sock, you would take off the regular weights off your machine, and you would either add weights to the place you're just using your heel, like with heel forks or a V-hook, or you would hold one of these on the inside manually while you work back and forth. So this is why having a ribber on top isn't something that would make this easier to use. So even a more modern machine, you would take the ribber off. I call it parking. It's becoming more popular. It does make full access to the ribber stitches and needles easier to access. And this is how I do any ribbed socks. I always take the ribber off. But this is a heel hold down tool. Dave has beautified it and brought it back, but it's just a wonderful device that in the machine you would imagine it threaded. It's very snug fitting. It would pull down on the fiber of the knitting, and you'd be able to pull down and keep that full half cylinder of needles that are making your heel or toe. You'd have full contact to pull down and be able to make your heel or toe more easy. All right, so what else do we have here? We have a V-hook, perhaps for when we want to add the weight on a heel or toe without having a pull down thing. You would take the stem weight off the back of the machine or the front, depending on where the rest of the knitting was. You'd take it off, and then while you were just working on this side of the machine, you would add the weight. Vintage machines quite often did come with a V-hook. It's V-shaped, and would sometimes have a second series of weights to put on it, but this is a vintage setup minus our buckle, which is actually vintage but from a different machine. So their approach at that time was to just add, either take the weight off and use that weight here, maybe with one less puck, or use the manual pull down, which is fine. That works just fine. So this here is a vintage buckle that generically used to have a very smooth surface on the inside two surfaces. I found that it was very difficult to use, and what I did was I scored them with my Dremel to give them the teeth that some of the other versions have, so that when you are applying your buckle to your cast on item or sock, that you're able to have it grip and hang and pull down. But this is what a buckle is, and we're going to keep it with this machine. Now this machine is pre-toppers, pre all of those things. It has a beautifully simple all-in-one part here. This is a yarn mast. They call it, what do they call it? They call it a yarn guide and spring, and they call it a take-up spring. So we call this a yarn topper with the heel spring. Now the purpose of the heel spring when engaged with the yarn is to hook into it to the yarn to take care of any slack as the yarn's coming off the source and going into the machine. So if you're going back and forth and you didn't have something to manually to take the slack out of the yarn, you would miss stitches because the yarn would have too much slack and it would just not be in the right space. So we add a heel spring to our work when we want to have a little more tension on the yarn for tighter stitches, or when we're working back and forth and we want that slack taken care of. Just prevents any drop stitches, makes it a little bit easier to use. I believe in using the tools you have on the machine, so you may as well. All right, and then you might see these 4 little screws here, and they attach the cog ring to the cylinder. Newer machines, the cog ring stays on the machine, but without the extra screws. So what I've done with other machines at this point is I would pick the bed plate and I would clamp it onto a table and we would construct it. However, this machine has a unique assemble, and by having its unique properties, it's a little bit easier if you don't assemble it on a table. In terms of clamping it to a table, it's actually easier if you take it to a flat surface like this first. Yeah, let's put the 72 back on the machine. So we'll put aside the 56. It's actually pretty heavy. All right. And we'll take some of the other parts we don't need right now out of the way so we don't collide with anything. There we go. Have a bunch of needles. We won't need this anytime soon. Maybe hook. We don't need the weight anytime soon. So, easy assembling. Keep your needles away from an iPad or an iPhone because they might become magnetized and start misbehaving. All right, perfect. All right, so here is our machine. This is our bed plate. We're going to start with that. All right, looks pretty simple. It has this nice little ridge on the inside. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn it upside down. All right, and by doing that, we have full access to the bottom. So first, I'm just going to move some more things out of the way. Here we go. So what we want to do is we want to take our cylinder and we want to put it upside down. Now we know up from down because up has the cylinder spring in here. And they called that the wire band. So that's up, this is down, and when you look at it, you can see on the side, here's the bottom with the longer, narrower, skinny part. This one does not have the number of needles or the gauge stamped in the bottom. And in fact, Gearharts are well known to have a variety of needle gauges, almost by whim, but perhaps back then there was a reason where certain cylinders that had so many slots had a different gauge of needle used. Perhaps if they had more slots, they had to have a narrower needle, perhaps not, but it is a little bit questionable why they did it. But if you have a vintage cylinder yourself and you are curious what's the correct needle to use in it, I would always recommend you go to angoravalley.com, Pat Fly's needle website, among other supplies. She has very in-depth information for which cylinders in the past, for the Gearharts themselves, the vintage ones, which cylinders had which gauge needle requirement to be used. Because of course, a needle that's too thin in a wider slot will have kind of drifting issues, wouldn't be supported correctly. And of course, the reverse being true, a very, very narrow slot with a fatter needle would have more issues trying to make a stitch if you're using yarn of any sort. So yeah, use the right needles for your machine. So this machine is one that is okay to use the 12 gauge standard Gearhart needles. And these are the ones I have with the machine, and I have extras and spades. So let's pursue the assembling of this machine. All right, so as I said, we have our bed plate upside down. We're going to put our cylinder upside down. And so now we want to put our bed plate on top of our cylinder. And when you do that, you can see the bed plate has these, don't mind the noises, there's no oil on it. I've taken a lot of the oil off, so more oil when I'm done. So you can see that it has, the bed plate has ridges that where the cylinder is sitting on, okay? So there we go. So now the next step is align it so you have access to your crank wheel, because the crank wheel will assemble a specific way with the gear ring. So when we look at this, this is the gear ring. As I mentioned, it has 4 screw holes. All right, and we're going to put it on the cylinder, but we're not going to do it just fully yet. If we just put this together and fastened it with the screws, then there wouldn't be enough clearance for the crank wheel to sit correctly, because it's angled, and in such a way we need to assemble it that when it's assembled, it locks in. So there's a specific way we do this, and this is why we're assembling it this way, okay? So if I tried to assemble it right now, it wouldn't clear. So what I recommend you doing is take off the cog ring temporarily. Your next step on the mount. I think I can put it this way. Yeah, I can, I truly can. All right, so now we're assembled. This is what it looks like. Okay. It's just sitting there. Now what stops it from drifting? You can see the hole that the arm of the handle will go through. So our next step is to put our handle through there. So here is our handle. The screw's there. So aligning it. Oh, and you can see that the handle itself has a kind of a flat divot. So we want the screw to hit that way it'll stop it from rotating. All right, so we need to put the handle, there we go. Watching, there we go. That should be about, that looks right. All right. And when I tighten the screw, it should sit in that little divot, and it'll lock everything in and tightens nicely. There we go. Perfect. Now I have an attached part that there's not much clearance to use. So there we go. It's okay, we're not supposed to use it like this. All right, so now with the part firmly installed, let's give you a different view. It's just sitting there, firmly installed. Now we're ready to put the cog wheel on. All right. And here's my trick and why will we do it this way. So right now the cylinder is sitting the most support by the table, and the cylinder is not attached to the frame of the bed plate at all. So all I'm going to do is lift the bed plate, give me some clearance to place the cog ring on the cylinder. So now a couple things have happened there. Great. So now I've seated the edges of the crank wheel against the angled edges of the cog wheel on the bottom of the cylinder. So let's zoom in so I can show you what I mean. So by lifting it there, by simply resting everything on a table, it's allowed me to lift the frame up and to allow the clearance needed to kind of nestle in this part here. All right. Because of course, right now, if I lift everything up from just the frame, everything lifts out because nothing's fully attached yet. All right, so now I bungled it again. You can see how it's not sitting right. So we will lift it up again, give us some room. There we are. And now it's seated again. So now that I can see the cog ring is firmly seated against the cylinder on the inside, and it's seated over here. The next job is to tighten the 4 screws that hold the cog wheel against the cylinder bottom. Now by attaching it this here, this locks it in the machine. So newer machines use 2 screws from the base going up. But in this machine, the cylinder needs to rotate, and this helps the rotation of the cylinder. So by locking the cog wheel to the cylinder in the frame, It's both locked in and allows full movement without any restriction. So, ensuring that this cock ring is evenly seated, the next step is to gently put in the 4 screws. And the 4 screws all look like this one here. This is cute little guy. It's like a mini screw. All right, so we'll just put the screw evenly in. And the screws are actually quite long. Okay, so we've got 1 screw started. And now, because everything is really not attached and it rotates easily, you can just simply rotate things until you have access to another screw. So often one of the questions I get from persons is, do we oil before or after? Once the machine is assembled, whatever machine it is, if it's a machine that's okay to have oil, if it's a metal machine, then certainly when it's assembled, you can put the oil on and the oil will get to where it needs to go simply by contact and gravity. It's certainly okay to over oil, just makes a bit of mess, but you will learn by how your machine responds, whether you need more oil than you're using or whether you're just making a mess. Now, it's not ideal to make a mess, but see, now I'm just moving the frame. 1, 2, let's keep going. If you assemble it any other way, it's just too difficult. So this is my recommended way of assembling the style machine. This metal machine. It's actually pretty smart. All right, there we go. Continue. There we are. It's the 4th screw. Once assembled, all the parts should be evenly tightened. That's a little bit hard to get to. So you can see perhaps with other versions of circular sock knitting machines, the more modern ones, or ones more modern than this one, that it has a little bit more difficulty to switch the cylinder, but there's a reason. The difference here being is when you have a rotating cylinder, it always keeps where the stitch is happening right under your nose, which is quite useful. If you have a rotating camshell, the outside of the machine, where stitches happen as it goes around, then 3/4 of the time you don't have full access to what's happening on the machine because it's going round and round. All right, now I'm just going to tighten these. There we go. Try to tighten them evenly. And once we've assembled this part of the machine, we can then safely put it clamped onto a table and then work on it right side up. Of course, this machine isn't a new machine, and so it's not like I had any instructions on how to assemble it. So I found this is an easier way to do it, and this works for me, and maybe this will work for you too. All right, firmly attached, nothing's gonna run away on us. Let's check all our friends. Do be gentle when you're handling any circular sock machine's cylinder. The ridges or fins on the top of the machine can break if manhandled. And a broken fin changes the stitch that happens on that channel. And so that would make a difference in your knitting. All right, so now we're ready for the next stage. Machine off the table where we were working, and we're going to put it right side up. And we are going to put it on our CSM table. Putting the table here and then turning this turn screw until it connects firmly, locking the machine on the stand. All right, great. So this is a smaller attachment on the machine than say an auto knitter or a Laguerre, whereas those machines, then they sit on this table, they're wider, and they also have double screws. So do make sure that it's firmly attached. So in the times before now, sometimes what they did is they would further secure their machine through their table with bolts. And of course that would mean they would damage their table, but if they were always using the machine, it would work fine. And this would further stabilize. All right, so here we go. We have our machine connected. It's secure, nothing's going to fall. You can see here we have the cylinder locked in, and you'll see as we rotate the cylinder, the handle's going to go around. And the same also being true. Keep in mind there is no oil on this guy, not really. So what you hear is metal on metal because it is a metal machine. So we're going to start now with assembling the yarn carrier cam system, holding our cams so they won't fall off the pegs that come through. And we're going to put the bolts of the bed plate here in front by the tension dial. We're going to put that here. All right, good. All right, so it's there. So this machine uses the adjustment of the stitch setting by raising or lowering this whole unit on this post. Changing the stitch size on this machine means raising it or lowering it. Okay, and then of course tightening it into place. So we're just going to tighten it at the bottom first. And that's it. So this is installed. The mast, which is attached to the topper with the heel spring on it. So for this machine, there is a tiny hole here that you can't really see. All right. So all I'm doing is putting it in like a screw in a slot for it and gently tightening the whole component. Gently tightening the whole component just so it's firmly attached. There we go. Aim it so that it goes right into the center of the machine. So the benefit here is the stitch is always going to happen in front where you can fully see it. So no problem there. So this is a Gearhart needle. This is a 12 gauge Gearhart needle. We're going to put one in at all of the slots that are here. Let's put the needles in. Now as you can see that there is this channel that runs along the top finger and a half distance of the cylinder. There is a cylinder spring in there. You can see the coils slightly. Now those coils of the cylinder spring keep it firmly against the machine, and they function by holding the needles firmly against their slots. So be careful with this. Whenever manipulating needles in and out of the machine or stitches to and fro, make sure that you don't overly traumatize the smaller coils. So using your stitch tool, when you first are putting needles in your cylinder, you can just gently put the bottom of the needle down and then let it sit in there. And that's our first needle in the machine. This is a very vintage machine. There is no rest that you would put the cylinder spring on, which does make maneuvering needles in and out of the machine easier. Newer machines do seem to have integrated a cylinder rest, and that means a kind of a place where the rest of the cylinder or spring can come out and rest on, giving you fuller access to the slots and making it a little bit easier to insert needles. But now that we have 2 needles in, it's so much easier to use them. Gently lift out the spring so you can just add the needle in. So all I am doing is putting the bottom of the needle down and then standing it up. Whenever you're working on any CSM that you're using, any kind at all, whenever you move the handle firmly. Try not to make any movements jerkily forward, backward, jerkily forward, backward. So anything short stops, backward, that's just bad for the machine. And in some machines will cause it to jam. Whenever you're trying to use the handle on the machine, you can move it slowly, but just try to move it with attention to movement, okay? So smoothly. There we go. So an open cam machine is a machine that has uplift cams generically that could be spring mounted or could lack a spring. They could be like this one. This one just has the uplift cams on these posts that come through that hold them in place. And when you have an open cam machine, it's more important than ever that you just move in the one direction. Unless you have all the needles lifted so you can go in reverse, or rather, unless you have a quarter to half the machine needles lifted so you can go in reverse, like to make a heel. This sounds ominous, but it's just the way it functions and the way the needle parts extend, that if you start with less controlled movements, it's just easier to jam them by accident. Another more important rule is when you have the needles in the machine and no yarn, please minimally, slowly move the handle of the machine. If there are needles in the machine and no yarn, potentially the needle latches can stick out, and because the yarn carrier is so close, you could damage a latch and not realize it. So just try not to move it too much. Because one of the first things a new user does, more often than not, is zoom, 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 turn the handle really fast, bend a bunch of latches, try to cast on, have failures. Failures are going to happen. Just learn from your mistakes. And hopefully it won't be because you damaged a bunch of needles. No need to be afraid of the machine. Just try to know why things are doing what they're doing. Oiling is very easy. Sewing machine oil, I run it along the cylinder spring all the way around. would recommend putting something under your machine to catch any excess oil that dances down. Universal cast-on bonnet is a wraparound skirt style cast-on bonnet that can be used on any cylinder with 96 slots, needle slots or less. So in this scenario, this is 72, and I could use this to cast on with it. So I'm going to cast on with our cast-on bonnet. Normally we'd go right across, and we could do that. What we could also do is we could hang from here, because this is going to be going last. All right, so when we want to hang for this machine, we want to hang ahead so that the needles have time to go up and then down. We don't want to hang a ring on any needle that's about to go down. So first, make sure all of your latches are open. And they are, yeah, they are. And so it's going to run here first. So normally I would hang this way on the machine, but because going forward on a rotating cylinder is actually reverse, we are going to start hanging from the left to the right. All right. So apologies if you're not going to see too much. What we're doing here is we're just hanging every second needle with a ring. Here we go. The method is the same as with any machine, it's just in a different direction because of the uniqueness of a rotating cylinder. There we go. Now these last couple needles are still down, which is fine, so we're going to stop. And now we're going to bring the front of the hung cast-on bonnet forward. There we are. And we have more needles to hang. So now you can see why it makes more sense. We were hanging from left to right. And continue. If you prefer, you could use any cast-on of your preference, but I prefer to use the bonnets as I find them most reliable. And none of them have damaged anything I own, and I've been using them since I came up with the method of a universal bonnet. Okay, good. So our next step is to add fiber to the machine. And we're just going to use some scrap yarn I have. It's actually very fine, which is fine, doesn't matter. It's going to work, no problem. So for this, how to thread this is I'm just going to come up and go into that hole on the end of the topper. And then on the outside of the yarn carrier, inwards. I could be wrong, but I have taken my yarn source and put it on the floor, and I'm just going to lay it in one of the loose coils here, and then have it come along the machine and then go into the hole of the topper. Okay, so that's how I've threaded it. And now we're going to go into the yarn carrier hole. And it's on the inside of the machine. And then whenever there's any slack like this, we will always pull back on the yarn source. There we go. So So now I'm just going to turn it slightly, and then you can see what's happening slightly on the inside. So here is my yarn tail. I'm just going to hold it and move forward. Now if everything is lined up, then everything should grab. There we go. Let's hang the rest of the bonnet. And there we go. And so now I can add my buckle. And the buckle that we're using today, eye to the sky, up, and then flip it open. You see how it flips open this way only? And I'm going to put the bonnet this way and take the eye and point it to the floor and hang a weight in where my thumb is, okay? So that's how this works. All right. Under it goes. Bring it up so at least more than an inch from the bottom of your work. Eye to the floor. And then hang your stem weight. And that's this thing.